Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Breaking Spectre here for another edition of Midnight Rider. Good to have you aboard for the broadcast this afternoon. A little bit different take. Usually doing these nighttime, but had a hankering, so here we go. Still waiting for D-Live to come up. Looks like YouTube's up, Twitch is up. Looks like Tiger Network is up at this point. We'll see if D-Live makes its way here shortly. But on the broadcast here today, a couple things. We're going to focus a little bit on the COVID stuff, the narrative starting to fall apart. And of course, that didn't take long, did it? And I thought this was about health at the end of the day, right? I thought this was all about health. And lo and behold, what are we seeing happen? All of a sudden, swear in old Biden, stand up creepy Uncle Joe, and magically the mayors and the governors and that decide, oh, it's time to open the economy. And oh, by the way, PCR tests and that produce a lot of false positives. Who knew? And of course, it only took a swearing in of somebody else for that to take place. And of course, I think we have known all along that this thing has been a bit of a farce, have we not? So that's what we're going to cover here on the broadcast here today. Glad you can join. Let's see if I can get D-Live reconnected here before. Let me try one more time. Let's try this again. And we'll see what happens here. So here we go. I'll see you back on the other side. Warning. These social media platforms may be hazardous to your health. Censorship kills. Pain coming. This has been a PSA by Breaking Spectre. Alright, welcome back. Appreciate you guys tuning in here this afternoon. Looks like I was able to get D-Live up, so we're up across the board. Glad you can join. Like I said, on the broadcast today, we're going to get into the goings-on around the whole COVID business and the narrative falling completely apart. So jumping right in, we get this out of Zero Hedge today. It says, right on cue for Biden. The World Health Organization admits high-cycle PCR tests produce COVID false positives. Who knew? I mean, we've only been saying this for months, and I'm going to go back in the old archives here and highlight a couple of those articles here momentarily. It says, were the conspiracy theorists just proven right about the fake rescue plan for COVID? Did the science deniers just get confirmation that it was political after all? The short answer to both of these questions regarding the COVID-19 case-demic and the fallacy of asymptomatic PCR tests is yes and yes. Ha ha ha! Who knew? Proved right all along. It says we have detailed the controversy surrounding America's COVID case-demic and the misleading results of the PCR test and its amplification procedure in great detail over the past few months. As a reminder, the cycle thresholds, the CT, are the level at which widely used polymerase chain reaction, or PCR test, can detect a sample of the COVID-19 virus. The higher the number of cycles, the lower the amount of viral load in the sample. The lower the cycles, the more prevalent the virus was in the original sample. And here's a nice handy-dandy graphic net that I've seen many times over the last several months. It says, how does PCR testing for COVID-19 work? Here we see the PCR testing can detect even very small amounts of viral genetic material in a sample by duplicating it many times over through a complex laboratory process called amplification. Number 1, a test sample is swabbed from the back of the nose and processed to isolate genetic material. So there you go. Get all sorts of mucousy garbage up there, shove it way up into your brain. Number 2, small pieces of specifically engineered genetic material called primers are introduced and bind to the isolated viral genetic material, initiating amplification. And here we see the amplification of creating millions of copies. And number 3, fluorescent markers bound to the copies during PCR are released and can be detected when amplification occurs. So the positive result? When there's viral genetic material in the sample, amplification occurs, releasing enough fluorescent markers to be detected. If there's a negative result, no viral genetic material in the sample, amplification will not occur, and no fluorescent markers will be detected. Numerous epidemiological experts have argued that cycle thresholds are an important metric by which patients, the public, and policymakers can make more informed decisions about how infectious and/or sick an individual with a positive COVID-19 test might be. However, as the news reports, health departments across the country are failing to collect that data. And I'm going to touch on that here in a moment. Says, in fact, as far back as October, we brought the world's attention to the COVID-19 case-demic and the disturbing reality of high cycle threshold PCR tests being worse than useless as indicators of COVID-19 quote-unquote sickness. PJ Media's Stacey Lennox said at the time, and this is a little bit of a prophecy that has now come to pass. It says Biden will issue national standards like the plexiglass barriers in restaurants he spoke about during the debate, and pressure governors to implement mask mandates using the federal government's financial leverage. Some hack at the CDC or FDA will issue new guidance, lowering the CT the labs use, and cases will, magically start to fall. In reality, the change will only eliminate false positives, but most Americans won't know that. Good luck, good old Uncle Joe will be the hero, even though it is deep state actors and the health bureaucracies who won't solve a problem with testing they have already been aware of for months, and Trump derangement syndrome is a heck of a drug. And now, as Lennox explains in detail below, we've been proved 100% correct, as less than 1 hour after President Biden's inauguration, the World Health Organization proved us right. It says in August of last year, the New York Times published an article stating that as many as 90% of COVID-19 tests in 3 states were not indicative of active illness. In other words, they were picking up viral debris and capable of causing infection or being transmitted because the cycle threshold of the PCR testing amplified the sample too many times. Labs in the U.S. were using a CT of 37 to 40. Epidemiologists interviewed at the time said a CT of around 30 was probably more appropriate. This means the CDC's COVID-19 test standards for the PCR test would pick up an excessive number of false positives. The Times report notes that the CDC's own data suggests the PCR did not detect live virus over a CT of 33. The reporter also noted that clinicians were not receiving the CT value as part of the test results. Yet, a PCR test instruction document from the CDC that had been revised 5 times as of July 13, 2020, specified testing and interpretation of the test using a CT of 40. On September 28, 2020, a study published in the journal Clinical Infectious Diseases from Jafar et al. Had asserted, based on patient labs and clinical data involving nearly 4,000 patients, that a CT of 30 was appropriate for making public policy. An update to the CDC instructions for PCR testing from December 1, 2020, still uses a CT of 40. Shortly before the New York Times article was published, the CDC revised its COVID-19 test recommendations, saying that only symptomatic patients should be tested. The media went insane, and Dr. Fauci went all over television saying he was not part of the decision to change the testing standards. I'm concerned about the interpretation of these recommendations and worried it will give people the incorrect assumption that asymptomatic spread is not of great concern. In fact, it is. So, of course, the mendacious midget had spoken, and the guidelines went back to testing everyone all the time with an oversensitive test. The idea that asymptomatic spread was a concern as of August was just one of many lies Dr. Fauci told. At the beginning of the pandemic, in late January, he said, the one thing, historically, that people need to realize is that even if there is some asymptomatic transmission, and all the history of respiratory-borne viruses of any type, asymptomatic transmission has never been the driver of outbreaks. The driver of outbreaks is always a symptomatic person. Even if there's a rare asymptomatic person that might transmit, an epidemic is not driven by asymptomatic carriers. There is not a single study or meta-analysis that differs from Fauci's original assessment. Today, within an hour of Joe Biden being inaugurated and signaling an executive order mandating masks on all federal property, the World Health Organization sent out a notice to lab professionals using the PCR test. It said, World Health Organization guidance diagnostic testing for SARS-CoV-2 states that our careful interpretation of weak positive results is needed. The cycle threshold needed to detect virus is inversely proportional to the patient's viral load. Where test results do not correspond with the clinical presentation, a new specimen should be taken and retested using the same or different NAT technology. Literally 1 hour after Biden takes the oath, the World Health Organization admits that PCR testing at high amplification rates alters the predictive value of the test and results in a huge number of false positives. That apparently via a tweet from Andy Swan. This translates to, in the absence of symptoms, a high CT value means you are highly unlikely to become ill or get anyone else sick in the absence of very recent exposure to an infected person. Dr. Fauci knew this in July when he said that tests with a CT above 35 are likely picking up viral debris or dead virus. Even at a CT of 35, the incidence of virus samples that could replicate is very low, according to Jafar et al. And so, not much point in really reading beyond that. I think we get the idea. And of course, here's what has happened since, we see the COVID cases, flu cases, magically, where'd they go? Where did they go? Holy moly. Apparently the flu has been eradicated, folks. There is no need whatsoever to run down to your local CVS or Walgreens and get a flu shot anymore. Right? And as Stephen Lenman noted previously, claiming lockdowns stop flu in its tracks, outbreaks plummeting by 98% in the United States, ignored what was called COVID is merely a seasonal influenza combined with false positives. Extremely high CTs from PCR tests. Well, color me shocked. And for that reason, the great 2020 disappearing flu passes largely under the mass media's radar. Media proliferated mass deception and the power of repetition get most people to believe, and having successfully killed the flu, they will now do the same with COVID. And if allowed by our betters, we will all return to the new normal they desire. Holy cow, folks. Can you believe it? You swear in a new guy and magically, World Health Organization comes out and says, we made a slight mistake here. Do you think they probably knew that all along? Come on, please. Who do they think we are? Do they think we're that stupid? Ridiculous. So in any case, carrying on that same tune, it says, why hardly anyone trusts the virus experts? And why should we at this point? So at a dollar collapse here in the last days says, early in the pandemic, trust the science could actually be used in a debate without attracting derisive laughter. But as the flip-flops, mistakes, and yes, lies have accumulated, a consensus seems to be forming that the healthcare authorities are no more trustworthy than the people running Congress or the Fed. We're supposed to believe their science, right? For proof, let's start with vitamin D, which sure seems to lessen the severity of coronavirus infections. As a chart below illustrates, couldn't find the source, but Google COVID vitamin D and you'll find all sorts of studies that track with this data. People with higher levels of vitamin D in their bloodstream tend to experience COVID-19 as a non-event, while people low levels found the infection life-threatening. Well, there's a shocker. And here we find the COVID-19 case severity Looking at critical, it looks like a population size of 48, 58, 58, another 48 or so there, and varying degrees of milligrams per milliliter of vitamin D. And of course, you see the percent, the cases, and so forth there. Nonetheless, there are obvious questions about causality here, so calling vitamin D a cure is going way too far. But if it has even a marginal effect, and the data suggests considerably more, a rational government would, you'd think, be handing out vitamin D like Halloween candy. In fact, since we're mandating/prohibiting all kinds of other behaviors, we might expect vitamin D consumption to be required, along with masks and social distancing. Even COVID czar Anthony Fauci recently said, if you are deficient in vitamin D, that does have an impact on your susceptibility to infection. So I would not mind recommending, and I do it myself, taking vitamin D supplements. That's in his own words, folks. So why aren't family-sized bottles of vitamin D arriving in the mail from the CDC? Well, a cynic might wonder if the fact that Big Pharma doesn't make much money from cheap, widely available supplements plays a role in the government's apparent lack of interest. Gee, you think? How long have we been saying stuff like vitamin D, talking about hydroxychloroquine, vitamin D, Z-Pak, all those things? Why is it not pushed? Because it's not profitable. Now, about those lockdowns. Tom Woods has been producing charts and appears to show virtually no difference in virus outcomes between U.S. states with aggressive lockdown policies and those without. California, for instance, has shuttered most of its small businesses and imposed widespread curfews, while Florida hasn't. Here's the result. And here you can kind of see the tracking. Looks like California and Florida scooting in here a little bit. Yeah, not real readable, but nonetheless, you can kind of see how they track, but obviously the cases net diverge here a little bit later in the year, probably when their policies net changed as, keeping businesses open versus keeping everything locked down. As for the rest of the world, where they're supposedly doing better than the U.S., the pattern of zero correlation between lockdowns and virus spread seems to be holding. France imposed a full national lockdown in March, after which the virus spiked. Then they added mask mandates, indoor and outdoor, with fines attached, and daily new cases soared. Why do you suppose that is? Then, of course, there's the lying Dr. Fauci. First claimed that masks don't help, when he believed they did help, because he feared mask shortages for healthcare workers. You got to believe it before you don't, and then believe it some more. He also admits to changing the official line on herd immunity according to what he thinks we're ready to hear. And in what sounds more like incompetence and dishonesty, he apparently had been answering the question, when will life go back to normal? With whatever pops into his head at the time. In early 2020, it was the coming autumn. In July, it was a year or so. More recently, it's well into 2021. Oh, so we just continue to move the goalposts until we get enough vaccines out there and I can enrich myself because, hey, guess what? I've got a financial interest in Bill Gates and a lot of these companies, and I stand to profit immensely. I think that's what he really meant to say. But the biggest and by far the most outrageous reason for this growing mistrust has to be the World Health Organization, which, well, read for yourself. The World Health Organization official urges world leaders to stop using lockdowns as primary virus control method. And what have we seen? Israel, UK, everybody around the world using lockdown policies. So how come they seem to abide in one World Health Organization policy versus another? The WHO Special Envoy on COVID-19 urged world leaders this week to stop using lockdowns as your primary control method. We in the World Health Organization do not advocate lockdowns as the primary means of control of this virus, Dr. David Nabarro said to the Spectator's Andrew Neil. The only time we believe a lockdown is justified is to buy you time to reorganize, regroup, rebalance your resources, protect your health workers who are exhausted, but by and large, we'd rather not do it. Navarro went on to point out several of the negative consequences lockdowns have caused across the world, including devastating tourism industries and increased hunger and poverty. And that's just a start. It's not just the economies, it's the livelihood of folks, the uptick in suicide attempts and those who have actually succeeded, domestic violence, all of that stuff. There's probably going to be more deaths attributed to the lockdowns than the actual virus itself. Just look at what's happening to the tourism industry in the Caribbean, for example, or in the Pacific, because people aren't taking their holidays, he said. Look what's happened to smallholder farmers all over the world. Look what's happening to poverty levels. It seems that we may well have been a doubling of world poverty by next year. We may well have at least a doubling of child malnutrition. In the United States, lockdowns have been tied to increased thoughts of suicide from children, a surge in drug overdoses, an uptick in domestic violence, and a study conducted in May concluded that stress and anxiety from lockdowns could destroy 7 times the years of life that lockdowns potentially save. The healthcare establishment could have saved a lot of time and embarrassment by just asking regular people about this stuff. But then, they would have made a lot less money. And ain't that the truth of it? Because at the end of the day, that's all they care about, making money. So let's take a little flashback here. Just recently, as of a couple months ago, dating back to the beginning of November, we talked a little bit about this, the COVID-19 RT-PCR test, how to mislead all humanity using a test to lock down society. And I think I covered this particular article out of Global Research at the time. You may go back on old footage here on the channel or in the old archives where I might have covered this. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll hit some of the highlights here. An introduction, using a technique to lock down society. This is all current propaganda on the COVID-19 pandemic is based on an assumption that is considered obvious, true, and no longer questioned. Positive RT-PCR test means being sick with COVID. This assumption is misleading. Very few people, including doctors, understand how a PCR test works. And of course, the RT-PCR means real-time polymerase chain reaction. In French, it means réaction de polymérisation en chaîne en temps réel. In medicine, we use this tool mainly to diagnose a viral infection. Starting from a clinical solution with the presence or absence of particular symptoms in a patient, we consider different diagnoses based on tests. In the case of certain infections, particularly viral infections, we use the PT-PCR or RT-PCR technique to confirm a diagnostic hypothesis suggested by a clinical picture. A hypothesis, not fact. It's not proven. We do not routinely perform RT-PCR on any patient who is overheated, coughing, or has an inflammatory syndrome. Nonetheless, I'm going to hit some of the highlights down here, some of the technical aspects to better understand and not be marginalized. The PCR technique was developed by chemist Carey B. Mullis in 1986. Carey Mullis was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1993. Although this is disputed, Carey Mullis himself is said to have criticized the interest of PCR as a diagnostic tool for an infection, especially a viral one. And that's probably the key thing in that to highlight here. Flashing forward, says PCR was perfected in 1992. As the analysis can be performed in real time continuously, it becomes RT, real time, PCR, even more efficient. It can be done from any molecule, including those of the living, the nucleic acids that make up the genes, your DNA and your RNA. It is by an amplification technique, multiplication, that the molecule sought is highlighted, and this point is very important. RT-PCR is an amplification technique. Flashing forward, RT-PCR does not reveal any virus, but only parts and specific gene sequences of the virus. So again, all this lockdown shenanigans, all this business of wearing masks, all this business of people being tested, as Zero Hedge has highlighted for several months, has not been nothing but a case-demic, and asymptomatic cases at best. It detects nothing. And so what have we been locked down for? And of course, here's that graphic yet again, which I just covered. Again, this is dating back to November. The gold standard preferred site for sampling is the nasopharyngeal approach, the most painful route. Well, of course, you got to basically scrub the inside of your brain or way up in your nasal cavity, which feels, I'm sure, very nice. Let's see. The RT-PCR can push up to 60 amplification cycles or even more. Here's how it works. Cycle 1, target times 2, you get 2 copies. Cycle 2, target times 4, you get 4 copies. And of course, it doubles with every single one, etc., exponentially up to 40 to 60 cycles. So when we see that the CT, the cycle time or cycle threshold, or RT-PCR positivity threshold is equal to 40, it means that the lab has used 40 amplification cycles, obtained 2 to the 40th copies. That is what underlies the sensitivity of the RT-PCR assay. While it is true that in medicine we like to have highly specific and sensitivity of the test to avoid false positives and false negatives, in the case of COVID-19 disease, this hypersensitivity of the RT-PCR test caused by the number of amplification cycles used has backfired. This oversensitivity of the RT-PCR test is deleterious and misleading. Well, there's a school of no kidding. Could have used another word there, but nonetheless. Nonetheless, it goes on to highlight some other things about this, but I think we get the idea. Again, I've covered this in the past. Along those lines, we had this from back in December. For the first time, a state will require disclosure of the PCR cycle threshold data in COVID tests. And this was done precisely for why the cycle counts in that of 40 were misleading. So we had some states actually abide and create their own rules and mandates and whatnot to provide this data, which in the previous article we said was not being provided to clinicians. It says we have detailed the controversy surrounding America's COVID-19 case-demic and the misleading results of the PCR test and its amplification procedure in great detail over the past few months. And again, we see the graphic. I told you, I saw this many a time. It says, as a reminder, cycle thresholds are the levels at which widely used polymerase chain reaction tests can detect a sample of the COVID-19 virus. The higher the number of cycles, the lower the amount of viral load in the sample. The lower the cycles, the more prevalent the virus was in the original sample. And so it goes on to state. I'll jump down here. It says, here are a few headlines from those experts in scientific studies, one of which says experts compiled 3 datasets with officials from the states of Massachusetts, New York, and Nevada that include up to 90% of the people who tested positive did not carry a virus. Number 2, the Wadsworth Center, a New York State laboratory, analyzed the results of its July tests at the request of the New York Times. 794 positive tests of the CT of 40, with a CT threshold of 35. Approximately half of those PCR tests would no longer be considered positive, said the New York Times, and about 70% would no longer be considered positive with a CT of 30. Number 3, an appeals court in Portugal has ruled that the PCR process is not a reliable test for SARS-CoV-2, and therefore any enforced quarantine based on those test results is unlawful. Number 4, a new study from the Infectious Diseases Society of America found that at 25 cycles of amplification, 70% of PCR test positives are not cases. Since the virus cannot be cultured, it's dead. And by 35, 97% of the positives are non-clinical. Number 5, PCR is not testing for disease, it's testing for a specific RNA pattern, and this is the key pivot. When you crank it up to 25, 70% of the positive results are not really positives in any clinical sense, since it cannot make you or anyone else sick. So, in summary, with regard to our current case-demic, positive tests, as they are counted today, do not indicate a case of anything. Ta-da! They indicate that the viral RNA was found in a nasal swab. It may be enough to make you sick, but, according to the New York Times and their experts, probably won't. and certainly not sufficient replication of the virus to make anyone else sick. But you'll be sent home for 10 days anyway, even if you never had a sniffle. And this is the number the media breathlessly reports, and is used to fearmonger mask mandates and lockdowns nationwide. And it says via tweet here, via secret name here, it says, I'm very sorry for your loss. Sadly, a mask mandate has not stopped the spread in many states or countries. I wish masks were the answer, but they truly are just a feel-good policy. I wish the data said differently. And so again, this is almost 2 months ago we learned of this, and probably sooner. In any case, we get this today, bouncing over to the vaccine side of things. You know, we were told that Moderna, BioNTech, and AstraZeneca, and Pfizer, and all these guys coming out with these vaccines all had 95% efficacy. 95%, right? That's what we were told. But where's the data to support it? Did they jack it up? Did we have any independent studies? So as we first, Israel's Fauci warns Pfizer COVID vaccine only half as effective as advertised. So instead of 95%, well, it's only about half that. So as we first pointed out on Wednesday, Israel, which has been leading the world in the race to vaccinate its entire, relatively small population, is quickly learning that Pfizer's COVID-19 jabs aren't nearly as effective as the 95% efficacy rate advertised via the Phase 3 trial results released by the company and the FDA. So the chart below, first shared as part of Pfizer's Phase 3 trial data, suggested that there might be a short delay before immunity begins in patients who receive the vaccine. And here's some data. It says cumulative incidence curves for the first COVID-19 occurrence after dose 1. Dose 1, all available efficacy population. And it continues on. It says, however, in Israel, health experts revealed yesterday that the immunity provided by the vaccine, especially during the initial weeks between the first and second dose, might be even lower than all that. It says because on Wednesday, Dr. Nachman Ash, better known to some as Israel's Dr. Fauci, said the first batch of COVID-19 jabs didn't increase immunity as much as they had hoped. He told local media Army Radio that many people have been infected between the first and second injections of the vaccine, adding that it can take 10 days or more for the immunity to kick in. Of course, none of this is particularly unexpected. As we first reported 3 weeks ago, local media in Israel reported that hundreds of patients had been infected after receiving their first dose. Israel also saw its fair share of patients with adverse health reactions, with one doctor even passing away shortly after receiving the first dose, as the country rushed to vaccinate its citizens with jabs that are still very much untested. Meanwhile, in the U.S., Joe Biden and his administration are invoking wartime powers to secure supplies of critical raw materials needed for vaccine production, as a recent logistical slip-up ruined 21 shipments of the Moderna vaccine, forcing New York City to delay more than 20,000 jab appointments. Well, it's possible we may find out that may be a bit of a blessing in disguise. Stay tuned. So, and of course, mind you, we're seeing headlines around the world talk about the adverse effects as well, right? You know, we've seen headlines out of Norway saying that some of the old folks and whatnot in long-term care facilities have passed away. We've seen adverse effects with a segment of the population in California that has given pause. And it doesn't matter which one it is, consequently, if it's the AstraZeneca one, if it's the Pfizer one, whichever one, your adverse effects are pretty much the same across the board. But hey, since we're on the track of the vaccine, Amazon says, hey, we're going to help roll out the COVID-19 vaccine only after Trump leaves office. Where were you a month ago? Where was Bezos? If this was such a hot potato item, right? Says on Joe Biden's first day in office, Amazon offered to help his administration speed up the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines, prompting questions as to why this didn't happen under Trump. I think we know the answer to that, don't we? Says Amazon stands ready to assist you in reaching your goal of vaccinating 100 million Americans in the first 100 days of your administration. Dave Clark, CEO of Amazon's consumer unit, wrote on Wednesday in a letter to Biden. Yeah, good luck with that, after all we know about the adverse effects and everything else. 100 million? Nah, not going to happen. Dylan Byers says new at NBC News, Amazon has extended offer to President Joe Biden to assist with national COVID vaccine distribution. Oh, wait a minute. What happened to the military? I thought that was all supposed to be underneath Operation Warp Speed. Anyway, says in letter to @POTUS, Amazon consumer CEO Dave Clark says, Amazon stands ready to assist you. And here we get their letter. Nonetheless, the company also requested that Biden move its 800,000 U.S. employees up the priority list when it comes to taking the vaccine, and noted that Amazon distribution centers are ready to be used as vaccination administering sites. Given Amazon's globally recognized efficiency in logistics, this prompted many to wonder why the offer wasn't made at some point before a total of 400,000 Americans had died from the virus. And of course, that 400,000 is probably very, very suspect, right? I sincerely doubt that it was a die from COVID, or die from, doesn't really matter. What were the underlying conditions? What were the comorbidities? What is the incentive, by the way, for hospitals to put COVID death on the old death certificate? Are they taking a little bit of a payout? What about the insurance companies behind the scene? You think somebody's on the take on that side? Amazon suddenly offered to help the Biden administration with the rollout of the vaccine because Orange Man Bad was more important than caring for fellow Americans, remarked Tim Young. There's his tweet there. Amazon was working with the CDC/task force to help with vaccine distribution during the Trump admin, tweeted another respondent. It finally finished and was ready to announce the help, but they waited for Biden to be inaugurated, so Biden could take the credit. Of course. Amazon is now offering China Joe help to get the vaccine out to America. So, in other words, Amazon chose to let Americans die instead of doing this during the Trump administration, commented another user. Yeah, unity. Where were you a month ago? Asked another. This isn't the first time that potentially vital developments in fighting COVID-19 were delayed with no other apparent reason other than to make Donald Trump look bad. Nancy Pelosi was accused of deliberately delaying a COVID-19 relief bill for months in order to help Biden. A biotech sector expert was one of many to also speculate that Pfizer deliberately delayed the announcement and release of its coronavirus vaccine until after the election so as to harm Trump's chances. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos and Trump were embroiled in an on-and-off feud since 2015, and the clear majority of Amazon political donors favor, guess who? Oh, just the Dems. So there you have it. Yeah, stand at the ready, so long as it's under our right guy. But hey, and further proof that this thing has been a sham from the start, all these lockdown policies, etc., etc. Now, the mad rush is on to open the economy. Right, Cuomo? Right, Beetlejuice? Did we not see that here around Election Day and the lead up to? Oh, we got to get it open right away, right away. Well, it's a little bit late for that when half your businesses have either gone belly up or can't possibly open at this point. Cuomo reverses, demands reopen the economy amid dismal New York City vaccine rollout. And it has been quite the boondoggle if you've been paying attention up in New York as to the rollout. They have no idea what the hell they're doing. Despite New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's efforts late last week to expedite COVID vaccinations by finally expanding eligibility requirements, after initially threatening to fine hospitals for supplying doses out of order, the sign-up process for people living in New York City remains bewildering, according to Comptroller Scott Stringer, a Democrat who is running to succeed Bill de Blasio as mayor when his second term ends later this year. Stringer's complaints follow reports of hospitals in the city being forced to throw away doses of the vaccine. Oh, wait a minute. I thought these things were so precious. We can't waste any of these. How do we make these screw-ups? Amazon, I'm sure, will surely fix it, right? Dr. Neil Kellman, president of the Institute for Family Health, complained to the New York Times that the Family Health Center of Harlem had to throw away doses when patients didn't show up to their appointments since they couldn't turn around and instead administer the doses to others. And despite the fact that legal repercussions could further slow the process, state authorities have investigated healthcare providers that may have violated vaccination plans, including the city's ParCare Community Health Network, which authorities say may have ignored the state's vaccine prioritization guidelines. In other news, Governor Andrew Cuomo delivered his State of the State address on Monday, and during it he appeared to finally hit upon something small business owners and restaurants around the city have been saying for months. If we don't do something about this lockdown soon, there won't be an economy left to reopen once COVID vaccinations have hit critical mass. And of course, here's his tweet from back on the 11th. It says, "We simply cannot stay closed until the vaccine hits critical mass. The cost is too high. We will have nothing left to open. We must reopen the economy, but we must do it smartly and safely." Worthy of an Oscar there, right, Mr. Cuomo? Award-worthy. We simply cannot stay closed until this vaccine hits critical mass. Looks like a repeat there. But anyway, some wondered what exactly had changed to make Cuomo see the light. Oh, so now that Biden is president, we can reopen? I thought the closures were not politically motivated, Stalingrad and Porsky said. Cuomo's words were markedly different from his commentary from last spring when he insisted that no American in their right mind would push to reopen the economy at the expense of human lives. So now that their guy is in, obviously, now it's purely okay, and the mad rush to push the dollars into the city and state coffers resumes. The problem is, who's left? I understand what the president is saying, that this is unsustainable, that we close down the economy and we continue to spend money. There is no doubt about that, Cuomo said at a news conference in New York City. But if you ask the American people to choose between public health and the economy, then it's no contest. No American is going to say, accelerate the economy at the cost of human life, Cuomo argued. And on Sunday, the city opened mass vaccination sites in Brooklyn and the Bronx, where shots can be doled out on Monday to people 75 and over. Circling back to Stringer's comments, the comptroller complained about the complexity of the sign-up websites, which required a multi-step process to set up an account, and another to make an appointment. To sign up, numerous questions must be answered and fields filled in. All of these steps might be preventing elderly eligible residents from signing up, since, as Stringer pointed out, there were more than 200 slots still available for Monday last night. And of course, this article is a bit dated from last week, but nonetheless, you get the idea. And of course, he says the New York City health site for signing up for a COVID vaccination is complex, burdensome, and buggy. But the problem is fixable, and it should be fixed immediately. They have two different sites. The H+H site is more user-friendly, but both are buggy. This is from the H+H site. Oh boy. Does this kind of not harken back to the days when Obamacare was rolled out with the boondoggle of websites and that they tried, get the Michelle Obama fixers in and roll this out and find out after spending a gobsmack of money that still don't work worth a crap? Sounds very reminiscent of that, doesn't it? Scott M. Stringer has a multi-step verification process just to set up an account, and then a 6-step process to set up an appointment. Along the way, there are as many as 51 questions or fields in addition to uploading images of your insurance card. Can you imagine, folks, that they want over 75 trying to do that? I'm sure they're all tech-savvy, fully capable of doing that. All this will be particularly challenging for populations that struggle with digital literacy and digital access, who have been hit hardest by this pandemic and who need the vaccine most. And some more of the ridiculousness there. Stringer wasn't the only one who complained. You get a few more here. The process for senior citizens to get the vaccine in New York City involves a 51-step online questionnaire that includes uploading multiple attachments. I'm sure they'll be able to figure it out. New York City finally reached its initial goal of vaccinating 100,000 people last week, but now Mayor Bill de Blasio is setting his sights even higher, telling reporters during a press briefing on Monday that he hopes to vaccinate 1 million New Yorkers, or roughly 1 in 10 of the 9 million people who live in New York City, by the end of January. Well, I hate to say, but if their own Scott Stringer here says that the website is crap, what do you think the likelihood is that you're going to hit that mandate? Probably pretty slim. In any case, quite the boondoggle. But as I mentioned just a bit ago, perhaps the whole vaccine business is a blessing in disguise with some of the hiccups and things that we're seeing. We get this today. It says fires engulfing plant of world's biggest COVID vaccine maker in India. This came out this morning. This is a large pharmaceutical production facility owned by the world's biggest coronavirus vaccine maker is being engulfed by fire on Thursday in the city of Pune in the western part of the country. This in India, of course. The plant for the Serum Institute of India was evacuated while a wing of it is still under construction. The new wing is said to be the site of the massive blaze, which is reportedly still underway as emergency crews respond. It says the Serum Institute is producing millions of doses of the CoV1D coronavirus vaccine, developed by AstraZeneca and Oxford University for India and many other countries, according to AFP. Local TV channels showed thick clouds of gray smoke billowing from the sprawling site in Pune in western India, the AFP report continues. In particular, the plant is expected to supply millions of doses of coronavirus vaccine for low and middle-income communities in India and other regional countries. And so here we see some of the video there. There we go. And it says, though little details as to the extent of the fire or damage have been given, a Serum Institute source was cited in AFP as saying it is not going to affect production of the COVID-19 vaccine. However, we wonder how this is even possible to claim at this point, given the magnitude of the fire. And so here we get another tweet here via Meg Updates. It says fire breaks out at Terminal 1 of the Pune-based Serum Institute of India, which is the world's largest vaccine producer and India's pride. 10 fire tenders on the spot, reason not known as of now. All is well, nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Serum Institute of India's CEO is also seeking to reassure the public. And he put out a statement via Twitter, says, I would like to reassure all governments and the public that there would be no loss of #CoVIShield production due to multiple production buildings that I had kept in reserve to deal with such contingencies at Serum Institute India. Thank you very much at Pune City Police and Fire Department. So far, there's been no reports of casualties, according to local reports. Judging by photographs and local news footage of a burning building, which sits on about a 100-acre complex, the fire appears to be extensive, with large plumes of black smoke billowing high above the city. Currently, India is the second most infected country in the world, behind the United States, with over 10.6 million confirmed COVID-19 cases, for what that's worth, and among these, over 150,000 deaths. So, there you have it. And as if that is not enough, we get this out of the Epoch Times. Well, it looks like storm floods threaten key UK vaccine production site. So, if it's not fire, perhaps it's a flood. So, vaccine production unaffected after authorities tackled flooding that threatened industrial site. Flooding overnight threatened a key production site of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Isn't that the same one we were just talking about in India? Somebody got it in for Oxford AstraZeneca? Just a thought. In the UK, as Storm Christoph swelled rivers across the country, local authorities in Wrexham, Wales, say they worked through the night, successfully holding off floods at an industrial site where the nationwide supply of the vaccine is put in vials. About 30 miles away, a river collapsed under floodwaters that sparked evacuations. The company, Wockhardt UK, said in a statement that they had experienced mild flooding and that all necessary actions were taken with no disruption to manufacturing. They said that they are now operating as normal. Wrexham Borough Council and said that Wockhardt contacted them for help yesterday evening. We worked through the night with them and gave them the resources, and it's been successful, but it has been difficult, said Council Leader Mark Pritchard, according to LBC. Says this could have an impact on not just Wrexham and Wales, but also the rest of the country. Wockhardt has the contract for fill finishing of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines, which are distributed in the UK. Fill finishing means getting the already manufactured liquid vaccine into the glass vials that are distributed to vaccination centres. In a statement on Twitter, Wales First Minister Mark Drakeford said, "Massive thank you to everyone who worked so hard to protect supplies of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine in Wrexham. Happy to hear that the supply has been secured and that the site is now operating as normal." In Manchester, around 2,000 homes were evacuated over concerns of rising water in the River Mersey. Prime Minister this morning visited flood-hit Didsbury area of Manchester, where people are now returning to their homes after the evacuation order was lifted. So very, very interesting. Little bit of an update, like I said, to what is going on surrounding the whole COVID business, this shamdemic, plandemic, whichever you prefer to call it. Lo and behold, everything turns to dust as soon as their guy gets in office, and we knew it would, right? We knew exactly that this was exactly how it was going to play out. As soon as Biden got in, the whole narrative falls apart, but hey, 100 days of masks, that's what they're going to push for anybody on federal property. I don't think that extends to the populace at large, but at least federal properties, if you're on them, you do need to have a mask per EOs and that were flying out the door yesterday as soon as he was sworn in, if you want to call it that. But nonetheless, there you have it. So we'll stay on top of it, folks. Appreciate you guys tuning in. And of course, we'll have a lot more to say here shortly in regards to some other things I'm working on behind the scenes. Trying to do a little bit of a update, as it were, to all the goings-on surrounding the cases net around the country, court cases, and various secretaries of state and legislatures still meeting in swing states to see some of the developments going on there. So stay tuned. I'm going to have a little bit more to say about that here very, very shortly. And until then, take care, God bless, and I'll see you back on the next one.